All right. Well, thank you everyone for those of you who could attend this morning. I know Sunday mornings are challenging for lots of people. I know some people who couldn't attend and will be listening to the recording. So I'm very happy that DNKL is able to record these sessions. So this is a very short um, set of verses that we're going to be working through over these next 4 weeks. But the flip side of that is that there's so much packed into them, and the nature of what I'll be presenting today and over the next 3 sessions that follow is trying to put into focus the essence of what these four verses, these 14 verses, um, include, and specifically how, on a practical level, you can put the instructions that are present in them into your own practice, whatever your practice might be. Because what you'll discover here is that the practices contained in these verses are for all Buddhist practitioners, no matter what your the type of Buddhism that you're practicing. Well, let me back up and clarify that, especially the first part of what we're going to be covering today, which is something called renunciation, which is kind of a challenging topic for us contemporary Westerners, just even the way it's presented traditionally. But we'll get into that. So, for those of you, I think most of you know me, but if you don't know me, there's a short biography of me on DNKL's website at the listing of this particular course. So if you don't know me, it might be good to check that out. Most important thing for me to say to you this morning before I start is that any um, mistakes that I make in presenting, not that I intend to make any, in presenting this material, are all my own fault, not coming from the actual teaching that I'm presenting today. And this is something that I need to put into my mind stream so that you know that I'll do my best to present the work according to how the work originated and has been handed down from teacher to teacher. Because as I take this on as a teaching this morning, it's a great responsibility. So this is something that I want to be clear of. And then most important for all of us is setting the scope of um, having a proper motivation. Our motivation should be widespread and extensive. And what I mean by that is that we should really be open to engaging very mindfully this morning on what's being presented within the sphere of not just yourself, but holding in your mind all sentient beings. And this is very important. It's not a meditation that we're starting the class with, but I want to read a verse that as we maybe sit together as a group on Zoom, gently focus on the words and try to hold in your mind what these words contain in terms of their essence. So, this is to set our proper motivation. I am very fortunate to have a human life with an abundance of conducive conditions for spiritual practice, recognizing the many ways I depend on others, relatives, friends, those who provide me food and other necessities. I wish to use my life to benefit them and other beings in the world, and to avoid harming anyone. To fulfill this wish, I need to work on my mind, decreasing incorrect negative mental states and increasing positive ones. And that is my purpose for attending this session today. May my attention to this instruction and what comes from it in my own practice benefit not only myself, but everyone else. And may it be a cause for me to attain enlightenment in order to help all beings in the best possible way. So that sets our motivation for our series, not just for today, but for the following sessions. So this text that we are going to go through that I have up on the screen here, and by the way, to give you orientation, what I have up here on the screen is actually three different versions in English of the same text. So you'll see even the initial opening where there's a homage paid. There are three lines, but there's really only one line. There's three different versions. And the only reason to include this is so that you could see the nuance of this set of verses as it's presented in English. It's often the variances are minor, but one version or another might be more relatable to you. And that's something that's really important to me is that you find words that you can connect to as we go through the verses. So you could see that even as we move through the first into the first verse, you'll see the number one in parentheses appearing three times. That's because that's the same verse. So as we go into the verses themselves, I will not read all three of them, but I want them to be present to you on the screen. Hopefully you can see them. And then I'll also make sure that this is posted for all of you so that you can uh, have these verses available to you for your own purposes. Um, I have to do that before we finish this session, so somebody remind me before we do that because I think I could put it into the chat. Um, so this is a text that's written first and foremost. We need to know by Jason Kappa, Losang Drapa. Um, Jason Kappa is a renowned teacher in the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Mahayana Tibetan Buddhism, um, and he's very familiar to many of us. But I want just to say that he was born in the eastern part of Tibet in 1357, and he studied with many teachers from all the traditions that existed up to then in that time in Tibet. And then what flows from that in terms of going backwards is therefore the commentaries and the Buddha's teachings that came from India in the form of Sanskrit texts. He studied all of these. And when I say the following words from my heart, I mean it literally. He became a completely realized master. That means that he reached enlightenment. He reached the state of Buddhahood. So for us who are Gelugpa practitioners, then we see him this way, appearing this way. He wrote extensively. His texts are considered uh, scholarly, academically, and from a spiritual practitioner point of view, highly realized and accurate. Um, so this is something to keep in mind. The most famous current day practitioner in the Gelugpa school is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Some of us think that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the actual official head of the Gelugpa school, but he's not. The official head is who's appointed by His Holiness and then a council of others is called the Ganden Trippa. And we are actually experiencing right now the 105th Ganden Trippa. His name is Sharpa Choji Rinpoche. He was only appointed a few months ago, and he's the successor to the first Ganden Trippa, which is Jason Kappa himself. You can read more about Jason Kappa, very concise biography, and also in the foreword to the book that was recommended for this class. It's not required that you have to have this book, but I will be quoting from it extensively. And that book, by the way, is called The Three Principal Teachings of Buddhism. And it is this text, and it's a commentary, which I'll get into shortly in terms of um, who wrote that, etc. But first, Jason Kappa wrote this text for one of his students, and it's one of his initial students, what are called the original four. Jason Kappa is known to have like two students that most of us who are Kalupa practitioners know, but this one was for Nagwan Dropbai, but he was known as one of the original four. Um, and you can read a little bit about him as well. Not too much, but a little bit about him in the foreword to the Principal Teachings of Buddhism, actually on pages 22 to 24, for those of you who are interested. Um, Now, in terms of the commentary that I'm sourcing for this, as well as a few others, one by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, um, uh, th this there are many commentaries. This one that we're using today is a commentary by Pabongka Rinpoche. I'll talk about him in a moment. But there are many commentaries on this text. The fifth Dalai Lama wrote an amazing commentary on this text. And also the 16th century Buddhist master Ngultru Dharma Bajra, and many others, as I said. Um, but this book we're using today, I picked it with purpose because it's written by a relatively speaking more contemporary teacher. Pabongka Rinpoche lived in the late 1800s through 1941, so an early 20th century teacher. Um, and I chose it because any teachings that we study now that have been written centuries ago, the texts that we're studying, um, they're going to be fraught with danger in the sense that we can misinterpret them, we can misunderstand them. The context, we have to understand the context for whom they were written. Otherwise, we might see it through the wrong lens. Most of us, there's a few of us in this session today who are monastics, but most of us aren't. What does it mean when someone like Pabongka Rinpoche is doing a commentary like this that is addressed to monks? How is he skillfully using his messaging, his language for that audience versus our audience today? With that said, though, he's really well known for not only having amazing teachings, but that he was known as a teacher for the common man, meaning ordinary practitioners, not just the monastic community, um, that he knew how to relate to them. He knew how to message to them and bring them what is sometimes very technical information that is deployed in, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, in a way that is set up to go through the rigors and tests of formal logic and meditative practices, analytical meditative practices that are quite challenging, especially when we talk about using Buddhist logic and the resultant debate context for how a lot of texts are utilized. Um, this is not something we know. So some of us do, but many of us don't know that context. So um, I'm leaning into Papunka's text because in the spirit of him being someone who tried to go out and meet his audience where they are, I'm trying to do that here. Although I don't know all of you like really, really well. I know most of you. I know our audience. So I'm going to try to project into the teaching wording and relevancy that doesn't negate or compromise the meaning and integrity of the teaching, but also make it relatable to us. And I will pose throughout the teaching um, devil's advocate questions, ones that I've experienced through the years of being familiar with this text that may be similar questions you have, and then maybe not. But then that will all be presented as well. And because even with that said about Pabongka Rinpoche, the text, if you've got the book and if you've read the text, it could appear severe, even only having been written about 100 years ago, the commentary, then it's still quite challenging, I think. But it's got complete integrity. And so the other thing I'll mention is that you can read a little bit more about him I don't want to go into it. Also, in the book, there's a snapshot biography of him right at the beginning of the front matter, and also he's talked about in the forward. The forward being written by the English translator. The English translator um, is actually one of my first teachers, uh, Geshe Losong Darchen, affectionately known to most of his students as Ken Rinpoche. He taught here in New Jersey for a long time, in Howell, New Jersey, and that temple is still there and thriving. So you could read a little biography of him as well in the front of that book. I don't want to spend time going into that tonight, today because we have very limited time. And my presentation is going to be a lecture. And so I want you to listen closely with that motivation that we said at the beginning. And any questions you have, just try to make a note. And if we have time at the end, I'll address them or we'll address them at the beginning of the next section. And I always, those of you who know me, I always encourage questions. Um, so next we'll talk about, before we get into the text itself, um, I want us to orient ourselves. I want us to realize the adventure that we're going on here. And it's a reminder really of like how we're exploring this Dharma teaching. And frankly, when you explore any Dharma teaching, you should always have in mind, what are we actually doing? Otherwise, you'll get lost in the jungle, truly. Um, so the first thing we need to do is have an awareness of what we're working with. It's none other than our mind. And we have to remember that because that will help us also interpret a lot of the commentary and the verses themselves. Um, and the second thing is to recall is like, well, what are we trying to do with our minds? And the answer to that is that we're trying to resolve our problems and be rid of them simply. Um, and what we're setting out to do on this journey, on this adventure today and over the next 4 weeks is clean our minds of negative um, qualities that specifically are the causes of suffering. That's the essence of all the Buddha's teachings. And specifically, we're zeroing in on what His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls the delusions. They're commonly known as like the mental afflictions. Um, and no matter what our delusion or mental afflictions are, we need to apply remedies to them. Buddhism is very practical, and you'll see that deployed here in these verses. And so we're dosing out today that kind of advice. Um, and so, further, we have to have a clear awareness that the suffering we experience is due to our mind. And this wording comes from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's from our mind not being disciplined or tamed. It's one of his favorite words, tamed, Tamed. Therefore, he says that it's fundamental that we have to remedy that. So when we talk about what's coming up in these verses and what's being advised, and when we hear words in the commentary by Rinpoche, by Pabongka Rinpoche, like think about or contemplate, we're really talking about prescriptive meditation practices. Essentially, Buddhism, we have to remember, is always about meditation practice. It's always about getting on the cushion. So I'll remind us of that as we go along. You maybe will get tired of hearing it, as a matter of fact. But I feel like sometimes people don't realize that. That's a simple thing to say, but I believe that. At least that's my experience in sometimes talking to fellow Dharma practitioners. Um, and to get a little more um, pointed about that, His Holiness says that you cannot, I'm quoting him, you cannot even be considered a Dharma practitioner unless your mind is tamed. So the only way to tame your mind is in meditation practices, specific meditation practices prescribed by our teachers. And that's why we're taking the time this morning and then over the next 3 weeks to explore this text. It is chock full of prescriptive practices to help us develop what are called the three principal practices in Buddhism. Um, so, um, to give a little more clarity to this focus, we want to talk about what brings about actual happiness in our mind. So we have to pull back and realize that through the channel of the ongoing stream of our thoughts, in every moment, um, if we don't use our minds with mindfulness and awareness, which are the two fundamental foundational practices of meditation practice, we'll not be able to resolve to bring ourselves to happiness because we have to be able to look at, focus on what's going on in our mind. So, no matter what the particular mental afflictions or delusions, as His Holiness calls them, you're experiencing anger, desire, pride, jealousy, whatever. The Buddha identified a total of 84,000 mental afflictions. We have to start by first being willing to look at them. That's a simple thing to say, but stop and realize that you have to have the courage and the peace of mind and be able to lean into becoming aware of the presence of these in your mind stream. You have to face them. So I call it having meditative courage. And one way you'll find when you get into certain meditation practices, like if you're a Buddhist or if you're a Christian or a Jew, sometime or some other religion, sometimes leaning into whomever you lean on from the point of view of being the master of that particular practice, the real person who has all the real knowledge, then this is like what we call going for refuge. So it's like in Buddhism, you might be familiar with the three jewels and going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. It's a real visceral thing, leaning into relying on the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners. This is all very helpful. I only bring it up here to say that this helps us to have that kind of courage and much more. But if you're someone who doesn't like to look at your mind in that way, I don't blame you. It's hard, but we have to have that meditative courage. Um, because without knowing our suffering, we can't work with it. We can't end it. There's no, like, how's that possible? That would be like a blind person providing us with a detailed visual map of like the city of Paris, complete with full descriptions and details of like paintings that appear in the museums and like I mean everything you can imagine, going to the Louvre and etc. And that's not possible. It's just not possible. So then this is important. Um, and then with the gradual process of working with the meditations we're going to discover, starting with today, when we look at the first principle of renunciation, we will discover that um, we can slowly, it takes time, um, reduce, create the opponent forces in our mind stream to be an antidote to these delusions. And they become stronger and stronger, meaning the opponent forces, and our minds become more and more tame. Um, and in this way, we become happier. It's an experiential thing. In Buddhism, we call it having realizations. And so, and it's very practical. I'm not saying anything that's like, what? Like mind blowing. I'm trying to ground us, frankly, in how simple it is to do what we're talking about today, but putting it into focus, having the courage, having a community we can lean into. These become the tricky aspects of it. Um, so we have to sincerely work to tame our mind, as His Holiness says. And he says that this is actually what Dharma practice is. This is Dharma practice. But if we don't lean into this, even if we maybe are doing what look like Dharma practices, that's not Dharma practice. You get it? I mean, I think you get that. I'm making it pretty simple. And then he further says that if you eliminate all your delusions and mental afflictions altogether, which is the goal of like Buddhist practice, um, then we can attain a state of what is called cessation or peace. And that is like what he calls actual Dharma. So then there's practicing Dharma, doing meditative practices like we're going to discuss today with purpose. And then there's those kinds of experience and that kind of experience of doing it to the degree where you actually eliminate all your delusions or mental afflictions. That's actually Dharma. For Buddhist practitioners who might be familiar with the five paths, that is actually known as reaching the path of seeing emptiness directly. So we won't talk about that today, but this is something maybe to encourage you to soldier on. Um, there's value in these verses. So one more important foundational thing before we get into the actual verses, then is to hold in our mind like uh, a proper worldview for where these teachings are supposed to be experienced, meaning a point of diving into them. You have to have like a world view, and I'll explain what that means. And here it's simply what the Buddha taught in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. He is known to have taught Dharma in three different ways on three different occasions, called the turning of the wheels of Dharma. The first one, he taught the foundational practice teaching of all forms of Buddhist practice, not just Mahayana, Tibetan Buddhist, Gelugpa school tradition, which is where Tsongkapa is coming from in what he's purporting here in the verses, but all Buddhist practices. All Buddhist practices built on the foundation of the Four Noble Truths. Um, so we have to have a complete picture or map of where we're going. If we're going to go into the jungle of the mind and start working with the mind, we need to know what we're looking for and what we're actually trying to do. So we're not going to do a class on the Four Noble Truths, but you really should be familiar with them. This is a graphic on the screen of the Four Noble Truths. If you care to look at them to refresh your memory, if you're not instantly aware of them, but they're the truth of suffering, the truth of their true origins, meaning suffering, the true truth of cessation, meaning the end of suffering, and the truth of there being a path to end suffering. So, for the true sufferings, we can think of um, the first one, just simply, because we're not going to do a whole teaching on this. Various types of unhappiness, death, sickness, old age, mental afflictions, etc. Um, and as I said earlier, it's important to be able to have the meditative courage to look at these things in meditation. And the Buddha specifically said in the sutra that you must be aware of suffering. You have to take the time to look at it, not only in yourself, but that's where it starts, but like also in all of phenomena, among all sentient beings, which is also the seed for developing compassion. Um, so then the root is this untamed mind. Um, it's the mental afflictions. So therefore, the mental afflictions are said to be the true origin or cause of suffering, as are the karmic impulses that arise under the power of these mental afflictions. And we'll talk about karma a little bit later. But right now, we just want to know what is our purpose of going into the jungle of exploring our mind. Um, and then um, the the third uh, one, which is they're based on the first two, is that if we could see suffering and we could see the origins of suffering, is there an end to suffering? The Buddha says in his third noble truth that there is an end to suffering, um, and that we must do then we need to work to end that. Um, and if we're able actually to end that, end the suffering, the origins of suffering, then we can reach a state of true cessation. This is the third noble truth. And then the fourth noble truth is the process that inform with that and having the energy of that, diving into the process of actually eliminating the various mental afflictions. and at the same time working to create an antidote um, to that, which is more good qualities. We call that virtue. And at the same time, eliminating mental afflictions or non-virtue. So the Buddha said, yeah, there's a path and we can take it. And that is really what is the setup for, like, if we're going to do the practices that are embedded and present in this text, then this is what we want to hold in our mind. We want to be mindful of, like, why are we exploring this text and the meditations that are instructions that are embedded within them. So now we'll move on to the actual text itself. Um, so first, the title. The title is called the Three Principal Paths. Um, and then this refers specifically to three foundational practices. And over these 4 weeks, we're going to explore each one of them. We'll start today with renunciation. Maybe we'll finish it. Maybe it flows over to the next one because of the long introduction I did today. Then, and so renunciation, just to have a frame of reference, is based on an attitude. Again, remembering we're working with our mind, where we turn our mind completely away from all wishes that we normally wish for that cause suffering in existence. So this is what we're going to be exploring in all these verses, and especially the first 5 verses is the section that deals with, like, how to develop that attitude of mind. And then the second one is bodhicitta. And this will naturally, you'll see when we get to the end of the 5th verse, which talks about where these meditation practices we would have gone on to do, leads us naturally to a realization of wanting to develop compassion and developing, indeed, and actually developing compassion. That will be our second principle that we discover in these verses. And then the third one is correct view of voidness, as His Holiness calls it, or emptiness. Um, and this is actually seeing the true nature of reality. And that's the most important one from the point of view of if we're able to develop a clear understanding and then further an experience of emptiness, it's that's where the power to eradicate permanently all mental afflictions and delusions. Everything else is navigating the terrain of suffering existence as best we can and doing certain practices so that we can have a happier life. And whether we believe in the continuum of mind, as the Buddhist cosmology teaches us, since that we've been here since beginningless time, or we don't need to go there, frankly. It's like, even right now, how do we improve this condition that we're in and have a happier life that doesn't have to be experienced the way that we normally do? Um, so then these are the three foundational practices. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that of the uh, one of the most important things to understand is that renunciation is foundational in all Buddhist practices, whether you're a Theravada practitioner, whether you're a Zen practitioner, whether you're a Mahayana practitioner, and there's like hundreds of different varieties of those, or even a tantric practitioner. Then without renunciation, you're going nowhere. It isn't going to work. Um, this is really, really important. Today's session of talking about renunciation and getting a clear-eyed view of what it really is and the practices we want to engage in to effectively take on a state of having renunciation is really important. But for us Westerners, like as I said earlier, I'm going to play devil's advocate as I go through the rest of the lecture. And it might be a little difficult to think about it, especially the way it's talked about traditionally in the text. And any of you who have actually read maybe even Pabongka Rinpoche's text, um, then this is tricky sometimes. So the first, we're going to start with the actual verses now. We talked about the title, how it's about these three practices. So keep that in mind. For now, we're focused on the beginning of the work. And we're going to try today to go through the first five verses because they are the ones that address that first principle of renunciation. But we start with um, the opening line, which I prostrate to my venerable lamas. And again, I won't read all three, but you can see the variations of that. So traditionally, when we say the word venerable or noble or high and holy, you can see that the variations there. We're talking about, it connotes someone who has turned his back or their back on all things of suffering existence and is faced totally towards liberation from that. And that's Jason Kappa here, venerating the lamas who came before him, who gave these teachings all the way back to the lineage of the Buddha himself. So then when we say this line, I encourage you to keep that in your mind, that this is something that has that nature. It's coming to us with the intent and purpose of from someone who has turned their back on suffering existence and is facing towards liberation. Might be something we want to follow. We'll explore and discover if that's the case. And then I'll talk about Lama or master. It means a superior person in the sense of someone who has both bodhicitta, that second principle, and then also an understanding of emptiness. So they have an understanding of these topics that we're exploring here. Um, and they bring about a state of the end of suffering. Um, so this is what this line means. And also from our side as a student and a practitioner, you see the word I prostrate. Now, this is Jason Kappa prostrating to his lamas. That's not us. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that you should think about how this might apply to you. Like as Westerners, as people who live in the 20th century, 21st century, sorry, I'm old, in 2025, it's like, do we think about like that, does that have any value for us? And so I just want to say a few words about that. Um, I would say that from our side, bowing, prostrating, and acknowledging the importance of a lama and what it means, which I've already described. But especially the idea of prostrating, it's a way to set, if we were to do it ourselves, some of you might do it, you have no problem with it. Some of you are like, what? You know? So I'm taking time for us who might go, what? Um, it sets our ordinary, prideful, self-cherishing um, self aside. And that has some value um, because it lets us let go of our normal preconceived notions. And especially if we're prostrating to someone in the form of these lineage lamas, we call them, Jason Kappa, down through Pabongka Rinpoche and down on through Ken Rinpoche, down through our teachers, and then also going back all the way to the Buddha. If you could think that you're prostrating to them, then this has some value. Um, it could be a skillful way of, like I said, letting go of your ordinary pride, and at least during the time of this teaching, kind of fully embracing what's being presented, that it has some value. Acknowledge that. It actually will help you hear what's being disseminated with a clearer, more open, peaceful mind without you overlaying your own narrative on it, if that makes any sense. Hopefully it does. Kind of loosens up your normal self-centeredness. And there are actually formal prostration meditations in Buddhism. And I've personally found that doing prostrations is one of the more viscerally and engaging forms of meditation practice that someone, if you do them properly, can experience genuine realizations. These are actually, it's a way of meditating. So there's a lot here just in one line. And some of us who are used to reading texts presented like this, they open with a homage. And maybe we forget this. So I take a few moments here to talk about it. I think it's important. So now we'll move on to the first verse, which is a pledge to compose the work. I shall try to explain to the best of my ability the essential meaning of all the scriptural pronouncements of the victorious Buddhas by the Buddha's holy offspring and the 14 passage of fortunate ones desiring liberation. So this sets the intention of the author, who himself is humbly expressing that he'll do his best to represent to the best of his ability, the very essence of the Buddha's teachings. He'll try to explain the essence of the high teachings of the victors. Any one of these three iterations of the verse you read, this is what's going on. And then further, there's another meaning to the essential meanings of all the scriptures of the victorious Buddhas. It refers specifically to what we're going to talk about over these next three verses, the next four verses, which is renunciation, that it is the foundation of all paths. I mentioned this earlier, whether it's Theravada, Mahayana, or even Vajrayana practice. So it's really the essential essence of all the Buddha's teachings. If you don't practice renunciation, meditation, and have the realization of renunciation, then it's hard to do any Buddhist practice that follow from that in a successful way. So that's how important this is. And again, we're talking about placing the experience of renunciation in our mind stream, that untamed mind. And so that's why we can listen to a teaching like this and read text about it, but if we don't take the instructional, prescriptive, and I use that word with intention, instruction on doing certain meditation practices, then it's very hard to develop renunciation. Very, very hard. It will slip away. You won't even be able to hold it in your mind if I say to you, "Oh, so what is renunciation?" You'd be like, So it's really important. So he promises to explain to the best of his ability these essential teachings, and here that one line of the essential scriptures, scriptural pronouncements has to do with renunciation. The next line of the victorious Buddhas by the Buddha's holy offspring has to do with bodhisattvas. The Buddha's holy offspring are what are known as bodhisattvas. We might think of them like maybe as angels, like in Christianity, but they are the compassionate beings who exist only to benefit sentient beings, to help them end their suffering. So that's bodhicitta. So in this first verse, we have renunciation present. We have a tip of the hat to bodhicitta, and then the 14 passage for fortunate ones desiring liberation. That's talking about a correct view of emptiness or voidness. So in this first passage, all three are present in terms of what we're going to study. So it's setting the table. And you can take time to read, like in Pabongka Rinpoche's text, some other information about like the Buddha's teachings and what they should include. We don't have time to go into that today. I'll point out one passage. I'm not going to read it, but if you look at Principal Teachings of Buddhism at the bottom of page 51, there is a text there that articulates for practitioners like what are distinguishing features of the Buddha's teachings. Here we're talking about the three specific teachings of renunciation, bodhicitta, and correct view. Uh, so the next verse talks about encouragement to study. So um, here, when we say listen well, I'll read one of the verses here. Listen with a clear mind, not an untamed mind, right? Oh, you fortunate ones who would rely on the path pleasing to the victorious Buddhas through being unattached to worldly pleasures and eager to make meaningful your life of liberties and endowments. So this first line's talking about like how your mind should be motivated when hearing these teachings. I've already said enough about that. Having proper motivation when you're attending a teaching or reading a book or meditating should always be set up with the motivation of benefiting all sentient beings like we did today. So this is very important. And then the second line, pleasing to the Buddhas, um, is one that, with no mistakes, um, the path itself that we're relying on, that we're going to embark on, the journey into the jungle of exploring our mind. That's a pretty tricky place to go. Never mind not wanting to have a blind person, just analogously speaking, lead us. We want to know that there is nothing missing, that the directions, the instructions, the teachings, as it's said traditionally, are complete, not missing anything. And that's what it really means to say the path that's pleasing to the Buddhas. And if we actually follow that path, um, then that's the proverbial being pleasing to the Buddhas. It's not like the Buddhas are like a bunch of gods sitting up there, like saying, yeah, yeah, we're pleased with him. It's more like, if you want to do an analogy, it's like a parent with a child giving them instructions on how to do something that they know perfectly, perfectly well what to do, how to do it, and why to do it. And then their child flawlessly executes that. It's like that kind of pleasing. So try to bring it to life, give it context, you know? And then the next line, being unattached to worldly pleasures. That gets right to like renunciation. So you who are unattached to samsara's pleasures, samsara is another word for suffering, Sanskrit for suffering existence. Unattached to worldly pleasures, that's clear. This version down here saying having no cravings for the pleasures of life. Yeah, so one would have to stop here as you're reading this verse and say to yourself, do I have renunciation? Am I unattached to worldly pleasures? And have the courage, like to do a contemplation, a meditation. Look at the flow of like moment by moment reality in your mind. Is that what's happening? Or is there something else happening? Our goal is to get to a place where we can be unattached to worldly pleasures, and that's what the next three couple of verses have embedded in them in terms of what they open up to us, in terms of practices, so that we can reach a place of being fortunate in having no cravings for the pleasures of this life. Also, we have to ask, does that mean we have to give up this life? What does that mean? Pabongka Rinpoche in his text constantly during this section uses like giving up this life. Well, what does that really mean for us, especially non-monastics? What shape does that take? What does that really mean? Remember, the key to answering that question is like it's about what's in your mind. So then we'll zero in on that in a little bit. Um, so at the last line here, it says, strive to turn their minds to this path. Strive to make full use of the freedoms and advantages. These are hints about like what's to come up in the next verse. Very, very important. Um, so, you know, there's a few other things I could say. I'm watching the clock though, so I want to be careful. So what we'll do now is we'll move into actually the verse 3, 4, and 5, which are the pith it contained the pith instructions about like what we do in order to reach renunciation. So first is verse 3, and this is telling us why you need renunciation. Since working with keen interest for the pleasurable fruits of the ocean of worldly existence while lacking a pure renunciation is no method for attaining the peace of liberation. In fact, by craving what is worldly, embodied beings are completely bound. First, we should strive for renunciation. So it's pretty straight ahead in terms of telling us, like, um, what our condition is. And this relates back to that whole idea of like, how's that happening? Be mindful of the four noble truths. Be mindful of what we're trying to work with, our untamed mind. Um, and then we might be able to start to look at the cravings, and we'll talk about that momentarily, that bind us completely. Um, and that's what we have to renounce. Not like being a brother, sister, mother, father, having a job, living in the world. And that's like what we need to remember as contemporary practitioners. Some of the language that, Pabongka Rinpoche uses in lots of the commentaries are sort of severe in that way, and they can maybe get us a little out of focus. And I don't want that to happen. So the phrase pure renunciation that I have highlighted, it must be pure in the sense of being totally disinterested. That's the word that His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses. Totally disinterested in. But I like to say it like this. These are my words, okay? Flashing lights. I like to say it like not experiencing in a self-cherishing way the glories or the so-called good things of cyclic or suffering existence. So, you know, totally disinterested in English means something a little different than not experiencing in a self-cherishing way. Because again, we have to interfunctionally function in the world, be successful. Why can't we be happy now in our moment by moment experience of everything? His Holiness the Dalai Lama says we should do that. So we have to be careful not to like totally disinterested doesn't mean like turning our backs in that way from suffering existence. It's really turning our minds, purifying our minds, eliminating mental afflictions. And this is really what we have to remember when we talk about reaching a place of having pure renunciation. Um, so, um, Another phrase you'll see, like in these texts, is like, quote, if we lack such pure renunciation and are totally obsessed with worldly concerns, there's no way to attain liberation. But again, what does totally obsessed mean? It means that it's something that I'm going to show a graphic here, another graphic on the screen. That way you don't have to look at me the whole time. This is a graphic that just shows some of you are familiar with the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. So totally obsessed is appropriate to bring this up here because what causes totally obsessiveness uh, is the three poisons. It's our moment by moment experience in our mind of either being attached to something in a self-cherishing, self-oriented way, or with the same sort of energy going yuck and pushing it away, which is aversion. And that's being done ignorantly because we don't understand the true nature of all things, starting with ourselves. That's what ignorance is. Again, we're not going to do a teaching today on ignorance, which has to do with like exploring the third principle, emptiness. But rather, we need to keep this in mind, though, that's what, when we see language, severe language, like in the text, the commentaries, totally obsessed with worldly concerns. Concerns is a mental, conceptual thing. So again, it does hint that we're talking about our mind. And it says that's no way to attain liberation. You're just going to be stuck in suffering existence. Whether you believe in continuation of life since beginningless time, like as in Buddhist cosmology, or just here and now in your life. One doesn't have to be concerned with reincarnation and future lives and all of that. One can be, and you can apply that. And Pabongka Rinpoche gives lots of language in his text regarding that. Um, so, um, yeah, there's a lot more I could say about that, but essentially, we're trying to dispel attachment and aversion, the three poisons, and then everything else that sort of emanates from that. Um, so that's what we're working with. When we talk about trying to stay focused and pointed on what are we actually working on when we're trying to tame our mind, it starts with working with the three poisons to stop um, the desire for this life, which takes us to verse 4. So, um, there's more I could say about verse 3, but we're doing a 30,000 foot view here to get us moved into the actual practice. Um, so here, I'll read the first one. By the way, the first verse is a version that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has used when teaching. The second one comes from, I mentioned uh, Nguchu Dharma Bajra, the master from the 16th century. This is like hit. And then this one comes from Tsongkapa, this one here, as translated in the text that we're using principal teachings of Buddhism. They all say the same thing. By accustoming our mind that there is no time to waste, when a life of liberty and endowment is so difficult to find, we will turn from our obsession with only this life by thinking over and over again about the suffering of cyclic or suffering existence, and the law of cause and effect is never false, and from we will turn from our obsession with future lives. So here, there's two meditation practices that we're being pointed to directly. The first one, when we talk about no time to waste, is there are meditation practices in Buddhism that have to do specifically with being able to take on a sense of urgency and correct perspective about how things really exist by doing meditations on impermanence, how things really don't exist, I should say, not exist, meaning everything's impermanent. Nothing has lasting, fixed, forever inherent quality of existence the way we think it does. And that has to do with the third poison of ignorance to some extent. So, meditating, even though we're doing a meditation on renunciation known as impermanence, it does also, it's like the flip side of doing meditation on emptiness, which will make more sense when we get to that later on. That statement I just made will make more sense. So we do meditation practices here that are on impermanence. And impermanence, the main meditation practice on impermanence is the meditation on both the, uh, the temporary nature of everything that makes up us. We sometimes do a meditation like on the different parts of our body. Traditionally, that could get kind of unpleasant from the point of view of like, you're analyzing like sort of like the filthiness of like everything from our waist to like how our body will even end up, in an unfortunate condition, wasting away. And it can be pretty graphic. And then the other type of impermanence is meditating on the impermanence of life, also known as meditating on death. So these kinds of meditation practices are talked about um, in Pabongka's text. There are some excellent meditations in there. Um, but for us, the one I want to focus on is the one that is meditating on the eight worldly thoughts. Pabongka Rinpoche mentions these in his text. And as a meditation practice, if one is able to see the disadvantages of meditating on the eight worldly thoughts, because I like them because we're working with our mind, right? Then they're a great antidote to just changing the fundamental ground we normally stand down in our mind. So those eight are they're listed in Pabonka's. You can find these almost anywhere, even probably doing a Google search. Although I hate them because sometimes you get weird versions of things. Pabonka's are stated on pages 64 and 65 of his text, and he gives us what those eight worldly concerns are. Worldly thoughts are being happy when we acquire something, and unhappy when we don't. Being happy when we feel good, and unhappy when we don't. Being happy when we become well known, and unhappy when we don't. Being happy when someone speaks well of us, and unhappy when someone speaks ill of us. So these are the eight. You can see they're in pairs of two, having to do um, with needs of this life and all the way through to ego needs and of pride, with fame, right? In the fifth and sixth one. Um, so this is a very, very good meditation. And further, but I won't go into the actual meditation here today. We're doing an overview of what the verses have. I just want you to know that's the first prescriptive um, meditation practice, along with meditation practice on um, impermanence in the form that I described. And those are pretty commonly found and easy to find, for example, in Jason Kappa's Lamrim Chimo and elsewhere. And I could provide some of those as sort of secondary meditation practices, like in follow-ups in the following weeks. I can send attachments to all of you. Um, so we really want to give up these eight uh, worldly thoughts. They are amazing. There's also like a good meditation um, on pages uh, 75, page 75 by Tsongkapa himself. Um, that has to do with um, having an appreciation for what is talked about in the verse here about there being a life endowed with liberty and leisure, um, and how you don't want to take that for granted. Like I'm 70 years old, and like I could see the hourglass. I'm not being morbid, but like I'm getting closer to the end. That in and of itself is motivating. But like Jason Kopp is saying, well, don't wait for something natural like that to happen. Do meditation that helps you appreciate this precious human life that you have. And there's so many meditations like that. So there's one on page 74 of the book by Jason Kappa talking about this body of leisure is more valuable than a jewel that gives any wish. I'm not going to read through it for the sake of time, but it's there for us. And it's a great way to say, I got to do something with my time that's less engaged with just ordinary things, or if it is I am engaged with ordinary things, then it's informed, where I have the right healthy relationship mentally and emotionally with my moment by moment experience. Um, so this is kind of an important thing to point out there. Also, there's a bunch of uh, uh, verses that are also an antidote to the eight worldly thoughts that one can use in meditation. I'm not going to go into them, but again, if you have the book, they're on pages. They're called the 10 Ultimate Riches, the four aims, the three diamonds, the three of being thrown out and reaching, thrown out, which the three of being thrown out, sorry, reaching and attaining. They're articulated what they mean on the pages that follow, starting on page 66. I'll just mention one, which is I love, which is keeping the wisdom diamond at your side. It's one of the three diamonds in the 10 riches, and it's great. It means never transgressing the pledge you have made to yourself, abandon forever all the absolute meaningless actions you do out of desire for this life. Um, keep your mind in the spiritual firmly and make your life and your practice one and the same. So here, he doesn't mean like giving up like your life, uh, but you can make your ordinary life one and the same with your spiritual life. People don't even have to know it. Maybe they'll notice that you're happier, more peaceful. Um, Pabongka even says that on page 70. He says, the main thing he says, now when we say to give up on this life, the main thing that you have to give up is those eight worldly thoughts or attachments. That's what they are. That has to do again with the three poisons, one being attachment. So this is a direct antidote, prescriptive way to work with these afflictions. Um, and then he goes on to say, toward not giving up, the main thing is giving up the eight worldly thoughts or attachments towards the pleasures of this life, meaning the way of interacting with the pleasures of this life where we're self-cherishing. It doesn't mean you have to give up on pleasurable things like having a barbecue or like, which I wish I could have today because it's been so cold, but it's too cold. Um, Giving up these thoughts doesn't necessarily mean that you have to throw away all your material possessions. So he underscores this messaging I'm trying to make for us contemporary practitioners, right? Um, so His Holiness goes on to talk about the importance of doing a death meditation, and that the most important thing about death meditation is that you don't you're going to die. You know you're going to die, and you don't know when it's going to happen. And that's meant for you to take in the meditation so that you can actually create a sense of urgency. Like I said, I have a greater sense of knowing I'm going to die sooner than later because I'm 70. So that gives us a natural. But again, we want something prescriptive that even if I'm 20, I might be able to do this kind of meditation. It's not meant to be morbid. It's meant to give you an appreciation for this precious human life and to be able to take life on every moment with meaning. Um, so there's lots of text in Pabonka's commentary that talks about this. Um, he talks about keeping death um, present in your mind, um, and there, and that means doing meditation on death. Um, in the words, life's not long, this right here, this is his version, remember. That's a meditation right there. And in his book, it's in a footnote. It's footnote number 107. He gives a complete delineation of doing uh, this kind of meditation practice. And it's amazing because the meditation practice, the footnote is like 2.5 pages long in tiny type. So it has so much packed into it. And then he goes on to say right after that, if you want more detailed meditations, this teaching of these 14 verses here, and particularly number 4 here, you should go turn to like the Stages on the Path, which is the Lamrim Chimo by Tsongkapa, to see more detail. Some of you maybe are familiar with Lamrim Chimo, then you can find detailed meditations there about that. So this is another important thing. And His Holiness also, I went and flipped over to him to say how important it is to do this kind of meditation. Um, so for the sake of time, um, I want to talk about this last line of this verse. Uh, Here, I think it's in a different place. Let's see. Oh, yeah, here. And that the law of cause and effect is never false. So, His Holiness talks about the importance of doing meditations on karma, on cause and effect, with the purpose of understanding that it's infallible, never false. He uses the word infallible. And that is a foundation that one has to stand on, along with doing the meditation practices on impermanence and death and the eight worldly thoughts and the antidotes to that. so that you see how things really work in our mind stream. Where does every moment in our mind stream come from? From a previous moment of experience in our mind stream that, according to Buddhism, according to Buddha, is filled on or based on the three poisons of having attachment or aversion to something and seeing it, not seeing its true nature, which leads to the 10 non-virtues of activity. 10 non-virtues here showing on the screen in a snapshot of body, speech, and mind. We won't go into them for the sake of time, but that we have to see this clearly, that what creates our current experience in this moment is a previous moment in the continuity of mind that we bring forward into the current moment, and that the next moment's going to be informed by the past moments as well as the current moments, which is, and we can change that, which is why we want to do these practices, that you can change what's in your mind, which leads to peace, happiness, joyfulness, if you practice in place of the 10 non-virtues, the 10 virtues. They all have a count and they're up on the screen of body, speech, and mind. So then this is like what we stay mindful of when we're doing these practices. So when he talks here about the importance of understanding the law of cause and effect, he's talking about what we call karma. And so we need to know, and this is on page 79 of Pabongka's text, again, if you have it, the four principal actions of karma. Actions are certain to produce similar consequences or results. The results or consequences are greater than the action. That means that they grow from the moment they're planted in your mind stream. And third, one cannot meet a result or consequence if one has not committed an action. That goes to like if you are practicing one of the 10 virtues, then that's only good, that can't lead to a non-virtuous result. So it's motivation to be virtuous and stop being non-virtuous. And then the fourth one is once an action is committed, the result cannot be lost, meaning it's in your mind stream, it's going to happen. So the idea here is, again, to have motivation to quickly move into these kind of practices. And by doing the four meditations on each one of these, and they're on page 81, at the bottom of page 81 and at the top of page 82, the four um, contemplations of action and their consequences, or actions and their results, or the causes and the effects. So this will, if you are able to do that kind of meditation, as well as other meditations on karma, which Pabongka talks about further in on page 82 and the top of 83, talking about like, the all four of them, like what happens with if you're taking and putting as an object in your mind the intent to do virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, and forsaking negative, non-virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. So these are very helpful. They're very, very helpful. They're there in the practice. So this becomes one of the most foundational aspects of doing practice. One of the texts that Pabongka talks about to underscore this is on page 83 of the book, where he says, the path begins with proper reliance on a spiritual guide. That's the Buddha, his teachings and his lineage, like this one. The steps of the path begin with contemplating your leisure and fortune. That's one of the first meditations we talked about. Doing meditation on impermanence and having and death and having an appreciation for the precious human life and doing something with it. And then meditation begins with your motivation. We talked about that right at the beginning of this class. And then putting, he uses the word religion, I would say spiritual practice into practice begins with observing the laws of actions and their consequences. So that's how important it is to understand karma. You don't know how many people um, that's a figure of speech. I run into many people, like when we're talking about dharma, and then we're talking about um, karma, talking about dharma, and then we end up talking about karma. I- People don't really know what karma is or how it works. They don't have clearly in their mind the laws of karma. And if you're a Buddhist practitioner, but I contend if you're any kind of spiritual journey, working your way through the jungles of working with your mind, if you don't know the laws of karma, cause and effect, which is how everything works. Natural science works that way. Everything has a cause, everything has an effect. Then you're shortchanging yourself in your spiritual practice. So, like, I implore you to really understand and know karma. Um, it's so important. So the last verse is how to know when you found renunciation. Um, and here um, we want to talk about, let's read the verse. When, by accustoming ourselves in this way, we never generate, even for a moment, a mind that aspires for the good things of a cyclic or suffering existence, and we develop the attitude with which to work day and night, with keen interest always for liberation. At that time, we have generated renunciation. So here, um, Pabongka Rinpoche says that if you contemplate all these objects of meditation that we talked about today, what develops is a realization in one's mind stream. It's an actual experience of renunciation. You know, the texts talk about having a disgust for this life and yada, yada, yada. I say it's a transformation and a subsiding of the mental afflictions in one's mind stream. And then in its place, if we are intently and purposefully and skillfully practicing virtuous activities in place of these non-virtuous activities, then what arises is a natural renunciation for the mistaken way that we experience life. This way, through the three poisons, not that we discard life. We're lay people. We live in the real world. How do we make the most of our current um, existence? So this is like practical for us on a day-to-day basis, and then it's also um, something we can utilize to move forward on the paths to enlightenment, which takes us to talking about how once we actually develop a realization in meditation on um, renunciation, then we get to the point where we've subdued and then actually eliminated our experience of mistaken way of experiencing all things with through the lens of self-grasping and aversion, where what naturally arises, not even for a moment, never generating even for a moment a mind that aspires for the good things of cyclic existence. Again, it's not like you're turning your back on cyclic existence or suffering existence, but rather you're engaging with it properly. And it doesn't even arise. You can't eliminate it. If you do that, that's what is called in this verse true renunciation, found renunciation. And then finally, that once one reaches that place of true renunciation, um, it's always conjoined with what another thing that naturally arises or a realization that occurs. That realization is an inner experience in our mind stream where we begin to think about, well, what is there? And it turns your mind towards the Buddha's um, truth of cessation. It's on the other side of suffering. Freedom, freedom, liberation, as it's called here in this verse. Here it's called liberation as well. Here it's called achieving freedom. So you're moved to want to actively do meditation practices that go even then beyond the purposeful antidotal prescriptive meditations to develop renunciation, and what blossoms is like room in your mind stream now to actually experience um, that what's on the next horizon, which is you could be free from those things permanently and gain freedom or liberation. Liberation is code for nirvana. And nirvana is a state that one reaches when one, in art school, there's five paths of accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditative habituation, and then the path of no more learning. And the third one is when you reach that path of seeing emptiness directly, that you've reached liberation or nirvana. That means you can no longer take on any new karma. And that's a whole nother teaching. We won't go into that, but that's what naturally arises. And then what naturally arises from there is that as you so intensely, to some degree, experience that for yourself, you have this deep realization that every sentient being experiences the same mistaken way of experiencing life through the three poisons and the 10 non-virtuous deeds, and this causes all suffering. So it starts to plant the seeds of the next principle that we're going to talk about in the next class, which is bodhicitta, ultimate compassion. You can't just do these practices for yourself. The realization of these meditative experiences bring you right to wanting to have the urgency to also help others. It doesn't mean you go out and evangelize. Matter of fact, evangelizing is not encouraged in Buddhism, but rather you take on the wish to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So this is something that leads us directly into the topic of our next week's session, which will be renunciation. Which will be bodhicitta. So I stayed at a 30,000 foot view on purpose, but in there, I gave you the prescriptive meditations that one can do for this kind of experience. At the beginning of next session, I'll lead us through one or two of those meditation practices. And then I'll also, I have to find a way to get the verses to you guys. Um, uh, I don't have one. I do have one that's printed, but I don't have one that's the full verses. I only have the first five verses on this one, the ones we covered today. So yeah, let me see if there's any questions though, because we're running out of time. Okay, so I just got a thank you saying they have to drop off, so they thanked me. So that's nice. Thank you. But are there any questions? We have a few minutes. Any questions that came up during this teaching for you? All right. I hopefully I've given you some kind of a perspective on what renunciation is.
John, somebody here has a question that came for this
Oh,
class. So just a moment while I get their question, and so I can
sure.
relay because the microphone isn't close to them.
Thank you. Hmm.
She asked, "What is the opposite of each of the three poisons?"
Yeah. So when we look at the three poisons, I'll bring the screen back up real quick. Ignorance, attachment, and aversion. The root one and they're represented by an animal, the pig, the rooster, and a snake. The root one is considered ignorance, which is mistakenly engaging in a self-grasping way or a way of it creating aversion towards things based on not seeing their true nature. And we'll explore that at another time. But the opposite of that is um, wisdom, the wisdom of understanding the true nature of all things, including yourself, which in Buddhism is called emptiness. And the opposite of attachment is like one of the Master Shantideva's six perfections. The first one, generosity. giving. The and you could say that that is also like loving kindness. And then the opposite of aversion or hatred is love. So like a loving kindness would be really more appropriate for that. Uh, and also the other word you could associate back to attachment is compassion. An antidote to like self-cherishing is giving. Informed way of giving is what's called the perfection of generosity. And then that can be done through actions of compassion. The best action of compassion is to make your actions filled with the intent to benefit others, specifically to help bring them to the end of suffering, but any kind of generosity. So then that would be the answer to that question. Okay. So with the last minute I have, like I said, just a recap. The idea here is to give us as contemporary practitioners a real idea of what this thing means. It doesn't mean life is disgusting. And in actuality, there's no such thing as impure and pure. In the higher teachings, this is like what we learn. Um, Rather, what we need to do is become informed moment by moment and live mindfully in each moment, informed with not being self-cherishingly attached to everything and not being discriminating in a unwise way where we're saying, I don't like this, I don't like that, etc. And there's all kinds of meditation practices we'll learn later when we get to the third practice of principal practice of emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness, that will help us with that. So what I'll do is I'll prepare any of you who don't want to wait till next Sunday, you could just send me an email and I can send you a full set of the verses if you don't have them. They're in the book. They're in this book, but I can send them as a self-standing document. Um, Otherwise, I'll find a way to get them to all of you at the beginning of next session, besides just putting them up on the screen. And then I'll also put together for you, if you're interested, a couple of the meditations if you don't want to wait till the beginning of next class. But at the beginning of next class, I will lead us in a guided meditation on impermanence. Um, and yeah, so I think that covers us. That brings us to 11:30-ish. It's 11:29. So if there's no questions, we could say we're done and say goodbye for tonight, for today, I should say. Let's see. I've got some things on chat. Let me make sure there were no questions. Oh, Susan did say, can we talk about renunciation as acceptance? Renunciation has such a negative load that yes, I'm glad you brought that up, and I know we're at the end of our time, but any of you want to hang for a few minutes. Renunciation as acceptance is really an important concept for a lot of contemporary Buddhist practitioners, and I say contemporary with grateful with gratitude, because it's like there's one Buddhist practitioner who I greatly admire named Stephen Batchelor, and he wrote a book called um, uh, a Buddhist Atheist. And in there, he reveals like how he practices Buddhism by embracing suffering. It might sound like whipping yourself, but he uses the meditation practices of the Buddha, such as impermanence, etc., to come to a moment by moment experience and acceptance, a peaceful acceptance and enlivened way of living in the moment, each moment. And really, this is another dimension to renunciation through a clear-eyed way of not rejecting our what can be a robust, happy moment by moment life, but rather be filled with real happiness, actually lasting happiness that we can carry forward. Whether we believe, Stephen, for example, doesn't buy necessarily into reincarnation in the continuity of life, Stephen Batchelor, the man I mentioned. Um, But that kind of practice is so well informed and I think very beneficial. Um, and so I highly recommend taking time to allow yourself to be careful not to say rejecting or giving up, or when we say turning away. It's of the mind. It's the way we experience moment by moment. And that's the true renunciation. It isn't, and so conjoined with that, it's almost like the flip side of the coin is this idea of acceptance, um, renunciation as acceptance of how things really are, informed, not like blindly, where we're just going along randomly with our thoughts through life to the end of life. Um, and so, yeah, my email for everybody to close up. Yeah, so that book Karen put in the chat is called Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist. Yeah, I caution people when you read it that his logic and deduction on how he reaches where he came to, I have lots of issues with, but they're more about what he says about other people's way of practicing versus his way of practicing. Um, than almost at the expense of. It's not. I like to talk up. I'm a real ecumenist. I'm a big interfaith guy. Even guy goes beyond just like having a open view of all methods of practicing Buddhism, but also all religions and the value of that. Having been raised like a Roman Catholic, for example, I have a deep appreciation for that. Um, so that's kind of where we'll leave it for today. My email address, if you want to request something, is J, the letter J, my last name, Cerullo 13. So that's J Cerullo 13 at gmail.com. And I think that will have to do it for today. Any other questions, including any tack-on questions to the questions we had today, love to continue the conversation. We'll do a Q&A right after our opening meditation at the beginning of next session before we continue with the verses. Okay, so can you stop the recording?